Well, hello, I'm Josh, and I'm back once again with another classic film to tell you about. And today I have a pretty iconic one for you. I'm talking about Don Siegel's 1956 classic, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Invasion of the Body Snatchers follows small town doctor Miles Bennell as he and a small group of friends discover that members of the town are being replaced by emotionless aliens who look and sound exactly like their human counterparts. As more and more of his neighbors are replaced, it is up to Miles and his friends to escape and hopefully stop the alien invasion. So, as I said, this film was directed by Don Siegel, who was an incredible director, probably best known for his collaborations with Clint Eastwood on films like Dirty Harry and Escape from Alcatraz, and was even at one point going to direct the film I talked about last month, Kelly's Heroes. But this film actually came pretty early in his directing career, shortly after his success with the prison noir Riot in Cell Block 11. And one of the things that made Invasion of the Body Snatchers stand out from other science fiction films of the day was Siegel's approach. Whereas most of these films were all about strange looking aliens and UFOs or giant monsters, Invasion of the Body Snatchers really had none of that. In fact, aside from the pods, you never actually see anything that fantastical in the film. It's far more dark and realistic than most people would have been used to seeing in their science fiction of the day. Not to mention the shadowy film noir lighting, which makes a clear cue to the audience that despite this very pulpy sounding title, this is quite a bit more of a grounded and serious approach to the science fiction B-movie. The film was based on the story The Body Snatchers by Jack Finney, which first appeared as a serialized story in Collier's magazine before being published as a novel, and it quickly became a genre classic, with this film being released only a year later. That being said, the actual concept of people being replaced by emotionless aliens was not entirely new with this story. In fact, the idea could be seen a few years earlier in the Jack Arnold classic It Came from Outer Space, which featured a fantastic story by Ray Bradbury. And that same year, audiences also saw this play out from a boy's perspective in the William Cameron Menzies classic Invaders from Mars. And though while both of those films do feature this alien body swapping, I don't think either explore the particular concept as thoroughly as this film. I mean, I just love how slowly they ease you into the strangeness of this story. At first, it just feels like a standard 1950s town, and if you didn't have the wraparound framing with the psychiatrist, you could easily mistake this for a completely different film. So much so that when Miles first hears that someone thinks their uncle is not the same person, he completely laughs it off. But the more cases he hears of this happening, the more he has to do to explain it away, until he finally comes face to face with a featureless body in an alien pod. And I just love the progression and paranoia the film builds, as it makes you second guess whether or not each person they meet is actually human. And since the film was made in the 50s, the McCarthy Red Scare is a very popular interpretation of this film, with some saying that the emotionless pod people represent the communist invaders, while others actually say that they represent McCarthy and his followers, who insist on conformity to their own social standards. And though I do think there is certainly a lot of value in these types of interpretations, it's also important to note that the writer Jack Finney as well as director Don Siegel both claimed that they did not really have any of these ideas going in and were really just wanting to make a good story. And I think this is definitely for the better, and probably ends up making the film much more interesting as a whole because of it. I mean, if they had been trying to make more of a political statement, it could very well have come across too on the nose and obvious, losing much of the subtlety, but as it is, these more nuanced ideas end up feeling much stronger, likely because it requires the audience to interact with it, rather than just being told what they should think. In an earlier video, I also mentioned a similar thing happened with Night of the Living Dead, which has a very popular interpretation of the film mirroring the racism and state of the country in the late 1960s. This being despite everyone who worked on it claiming that at the time they were just trying to make a good horror movie, but they couldn't help reflecting the world around them, and I think the same could be said for this film. And in addition to having just as pulpy of a B-movie title as Night of the Living Dead, Invasion of the Body Snatchers also happened to spawn several remakes/sequels. Now it's a bit fuzzy as to whether or not some of the remakes are actually supposed to be sequels, as though each one reboots the story, they often carry over elements and even characters from previous films. I mean, the 90s movie even has the tagline, "The Invasion Continues." But regardless, it's really interesting to look at these films and see how each retelling of the story actually reflects on the specific time it was made in, with the 78 version moving the story to the big city and commenting on the consumerism as well as the new age groups that were coming up around the time. And the 93 version, just called Body Snatchers, is set on a military base and looks at the loss of individuality within the army, while the '07 remake, simply called The Invasion, is set in Washington, D.C. and looks at the story through the lens of a pandemic and people's fear of, along with the government, the CDC and vaccination. And so even though it's over a decade old, it still makes for an interesting watch in light of recent pandemics. And though I personally find the first two versions to be the best, I still find all of them to be pretty enjoyable and add their own interesting spins on the concept, though the last two clearly had much more studio changes with multiple writers and directors working on each film that hold them back a bit from feeling like fully cohesive films. Though to be honest, this could even be said for this film, as that wraparound framing of Miles being taken to a psychiatrist and retelling this story was added after the film was already shot, and in a way kind of takes out a bit of the film's tension. However, these scenes are largely saved by the great casting of the two doctors who take Miles in. Any fan of classic film and TV from this period will be pleased to see that they are played by none other than Richard Deacon and Whit Bissell, who appeared in quite literally hundreds of movies and TV shows from the time. Richard Deacon played classic characters in both The Dick Van Dyke Show and Leave It to Beaver, while Whit Bissell was in everything from The Creature from the Black Lagoon to Soylent Green. So despite these scenes feeling pretty tacked on, they do bring a bit of B-movie charm with them thanks to the casting. And I think that's a good segue to the rest of this cast. The main character in the film, Miles Bennell, is played by the great character actor Kevin McCarthy. And this is actually one of his few leading roles, as he is much better known today for his supporting characters and was a frequent collaborator with director Joe Dante, who is a very big fan of this movie and even worked some bits of the film into his own classic Gremlins. And McCarthy actually reprised this role 2 more times in his career, first being in the 1978 remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which, as I mentioned earlier, is revealed to be almost a sequel, showing Miles to still be running 20 years later, trying to warn people. It works as a nice nod to the original film, while not taking away from the story, as it is still very chilling to see, even for those with no knowledge of the original. But most people forget that McCarthy actually played Miles one more time for a brief gag in Joe Dante's Looney Tunes Back in Action, where he comes out of a machine clutching a pod, still humorously black and white, as if he had come right off the screen of the original film. And as much as I've been talking about Kevin McCarthy's performance, he was definitely not alone. The film also features Donna Wynter, who does a great job as Becky Driscoll and was a pretty experienced actress by this point, appearing in mostly theater and live television plays, and King Donovan does a fantastic job as Miles' friend, the writer Jack Belichick. And you can also see Carolyn Jones, best known as Morticia Addams of the Addams Family, as Jack's wife Theodora. Larry Gates is wonderful as Dr. Kaufman, and an interesting fact, he was actually the one who encouraged Kevin McCarthy to join in his first play back in college. And there are tons of other great actors from the period here, like Dabbs Greer and Virginia Christine, but probably one of the most surprising choices has to be Charlie the Meter Reader, who is played by none other than Sam Peckinpah, who was also the dialogue coach on the film, and more famously went on to direct classics like The Wild Bunch, The Getaway, and Straw Dogs. So if you want to watch Invasion of the Body Snatchers, it is available on all the usual places as a rent or buy option. And I often see it streaming on Amazon Prime as well if you happen to have that. And physically, it's pretty easy to get a hold of as well. This version I have here is from Olive Signature, and it looks great, packed with tons of bonus features, and is probably the best way to get it nowadays. And while there's no fancy Criterion Blu-ray for this one, I did find that this was on Laserdisc through Criterion back in the day, so I guess you can pick that up as well if you want to. But anyways, now for my comment question, I'm wondering, what is your favorite really classic sci-fi film? I mean, Invasion of the Body Snatchers is certainly one of the more famous ones, even though, especially in this version, a lot of these science fiction elements are actually a little more subdued. But there are tons out there to choose from, and for that matter, there are even several versions of this story to choose from. I know a lot of people, myself included, really like the 78 version with Donald Sutherland. But go ahead and put your favorites in the comment section down below and start discussing. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe if you want to see some more of these. Remember to keep watching movies, and I will see you again soon.